They didn't look at her when they spoke, as if what they were saying was nothing more than a routine decision. The dining room, usually humming with the comfort of familiarity, turned cold with their words. Her father's voice was steady, clinical, as he informed her that she was no longer their concern. No inheritance, no place in the family, not even the shallow reassurance of love they once pretended to offer. Her mother didn't protest, didn't soften the blow, just nodded, as though this was all inevitable. In a single moment, the world she had clung to shattered, but she didn't let the pieces cut her. She sat still, back straight, and accepted the cruelty like a stone accepts rain. They thought her silence was weakness. It was not. She let the storm gather inside her without a word. The instinct to cry, to plead, flickered once but died before it reached her lips. They wanted to see her break, to see her collapse into the role of the discarded daughter. Instead, she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that meant nothing to them, but to her it was a mask. Beneath it, something sharper took root, a quiet fire, a steady rhythm of calculation disguised as surrender. She gave them the obedience they expected, lowering her head, nodding at their final judgment, but every echo of their cruelty pressed deeper into her memory, shaping something she would not yet reveal. As the days passed, fragments of the past replayed with brutal clarity. Every late night she had stayed up to finish their paperwork, every dream she had shelved to keep their image untarnished, every kindness returned with indifference. It all unfolded like scenes from a play she had once taken pride in performing. Now, each memory only sharpened her resolve. They believed she had no steel, that she was nothing more than pliant hands and a quiet voice. But she could feel the edges forming, quiet blades hidden behind her smile. She began to understand that the years of sacrifice had not been wasted. They had been training. She stopped being the daughter they remembered. Something inside her shifted, as quiet as a shadow but as irreversible as the breaking of glass. She spoke less, listened more. Her silence was no longer submission, it was calculation. She began to move with intent, mapping not the life they wanted for her, but the one she would design on her own terms. They had reduced her to nothing, but in stripping her bare, they had given her clarity. She no longer craved their approval. What she craved was balance, the kind only justice could bring, but they didn't see it. They didn't notice the way her eyes no longer softened when they entered the room. They didn't hear the steel beneath her carefully even tone. They were blinded by their own arrogance, certain that their rejection had ended her story. What they didn't realize was that they had only written the opening chapter of a far greater one. They had crossed a line they thought invisible, a line that turned a daughter into something far more dangerous. She left their house with nothing, no suitcase, no savings, not even the trinkets she had once clung to for comfort. But in her mind, she carried everything. She carried the map of their weaknesses, the knowledge of their blind spots, the truths they had always thought she was too obedient to notice. The fire that burned in her chest wasn't desperation, it was purpose. They thought they had taken everything from her. In reality, they had given her the freedom to strike. Every insult, every cold dismissal, every word meant to break her settled into her bones like fuel. She didn't rage against it. She stored it. She molded it. Each syllable of cruelty became part of a plan, They had cast her aside with the belief she was powerless, but that mistake would be the undoing they never saw coming. For now, she kept her steps soft, her voice calm, her face unassuming. But beneath that still surface, the storm was forming vast, patient, and unstoppable. The house shone like a polished mask, its corridors lined with framed photographs, its furniture gleaming under curated lighting. Outsiders called it perfect, an image of unity, a family of order and love. But perfection was only a surface. Beneath every glance, every decision carried a ruthless calculation. Love was not the currency here. Power was. Image mattered more than truth, and appearances outweighed affection. To survive in that house was not to be loved, but to perform, to fit the script written long before she had a voice of her own. She grew up under a shadow not of her own making. Her brother was the son, reckless and indulgent, yet adored as though he could do no wrong. His failures became lessons, his excesses transformed into charming quirks, his irresponsibility reframed as passion. The more he stumbled, the more they shielded him. She, on the other hand, became invisible. Her achievements were expected, her sacrifices absorbed without recognition. If she stayed late, if she cleaned the mess, if she held the house together, no one clapped. Her quiet work was background noise to his spotlight, and in that spotlight, she was always cast as lesser, though she carried twice the weight. Her burden was silence and duty. While he chased indulgence, she became the anchor, the one they leaned on without ever thanking. She smoothed arguments at the dinner table, managed tasks her parents ignored, tended to details that kept their reputation untarnished. Yet she was never seen. She was the scaffolding that held their perfect facade in place, strong but hidden, and they walked past her without noticing. She carried the title of the good daughter, not as a badge of honor, but as a shackle. It was demanded of her, never celebrated. Every quiet act of devotion sank into the void, unacknowledged, unreturned. Looking back, she could trace the betrayal long before it came. Tiny moments that seemed small at the time but later revealed themselves as warnings. A prize won at school dismissed as not as important as your brother's football medal. Promises made and broken without apology. The times they let him speak over her, laugh at her expense, or diminish her choices with a wave of the hand. She remembered it all, every seed planted in silence. Alone in her room, she replayed those moments and realized they had been foreshadowing. The storm she now felt building. The older she grew, the sharper her parents' obsession became. Reputation was their obsession, inheritance their battlefield. To them, family wasn't love, it was legacy. Each decision became a transaction. Who made them look better, who carried their name with more shine, who could be cut away without consequence. They spoke of family pride the way merchants speak of profit margins, reducing blood and bond to numbers and appearances. In such a world, betrayal wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. She saw it now with painful clarity. Her brother learned their language faster than she did. He became fluent in charm, twisting words to bend them to his will. He fed them stories, manipulations that shifted blame away from him and onto her. She could feel it happening in real time. The looks that grew colder, the conversations that thinned, the subtle ways her parents began to treat her as secondary. He painted her as rigid, unyielding, unnecessary. She watched as they nodded at his lies, eager to believe the version of her that made their golden sun shine brighter. And slowly, she felt herself being erased, but she did not fight, not with words, not with outbursts. She knew arguments would be wasted. Her voice had never truly been heard in that house, so she withdrew into silence. They mistook her quiet for surrender, her composure for weakness. What they did not see was the fire she held behind her calm gaze. Her silence was not emptiness. It was a weapon, sharp and waiting. She would let them underestimate her, let them believe she had accepted her fate. That belief would become their blind spot, and so she began to keep her records. Not diaries of feelings, not confessions of grief, but observations, notes in her mind, fragments of hypocrisy she could one day use. She remembered her father's lectures on honesty, spoken hours before he lied to cover her brother's mistake. She memorized her mother's words about loyalty, spoken just before she betrayed her trust. She noted the way her brother boasted about manipulating them, laughing at their blindness. Every word, every action, every secret moment of arrogance, they were fuel. She gathered them like pearls on a string, hidden and invisible to them. She was still the background, the silent, overlooked daughter who did not matter, but she knew better. Each pearl she collected was a weapon, and when the time came, she would thread those pearls into a noose they would never see until it tightened around them. It began with something small, an unfamiliar name on a receipt tucked carelessly into a desk drawer. At first, she thought it was nothing, a slip of paper that had landed where it shouldn't. But the numbers didn't lie. The sum was too large, the signature too practiced. She dug deeper and the cracks began to spread. Hidden debts, concealed accounts, secret dealings, all buried beneath the shine of their perfect image. The empire they paraded so proudly was nothing more than a carefully arranged lie. For years she had believed their strength unshakable, their success unquestionable. Now she saw the truth, and with it, her place in their game shifted. The more she searched, the more the walls whispered. Emails left open too long, bank statements discarded too quickly. Conversations dropped when she entered the room. Every shred of evidence became a piece of her private arsenal. She learned to listen in silence, to copy files when no one was looking, to memorize numbers and phrases that meant nothing to them but everything to her. They thought her invisible, too obedient to notice, but invisibility was the sharpest weapon. She could move through their shadows, collecting proof while they remained blind. The arrogance of control was their undoing. Her parents flaunted dominance like a crown, convinced that fear and money kept the world beneath their feet. They spoke with authority, spent recklessly, dismissed consequences as though rules applied only to others. Yet every boast, every careless declaration of power became another weakness exposed. They believed no one could touch them, least of all their quiet daughter. What they did not see was how their confidence fed her, how each careless display of control built the foundation of her strategy. The memories cut deeper now than they ever had before. Flashbacks returned with a new sharpness, each one slicing into her with renewed force. She remembered the jobs she gave up because they needed her at home, the savings she handed over when her brother's mistakes had to be buried, the opportunities she sacrificed to keep the family's name unblemished. She had swallowed those wounds, told herself it was duty, that love required giving. But now she saw them for what they were: sacrifices demanded, never appreciated, never repaid. Each memory became a blade, honed and ready to carve her path forward. Outwardly, she wore the mask they had crafted for her: the obedient daughter, the quiet listener, the one who bent without breaking. She lowered her eyes when they spoke, agreed when they dictated, laughed when they expected amusement. To them, she was predictable. But behind that mask, something far sharper was forming. Obedience became camouflage, silence became strategy. She was no longer the daughter they dismissed, she was the strategist they had created without knowing. Day by day, the trap took shape. She cataloged everything with precision: notes scribbled in margins, dates circled, files duplicated and hidden away. Every overheard slip of the tongue was filed in her mind, every careless error preserved. The puzzle pieces fit together slowly, but with purpose. They believed they were untouchable, but she was constructing a weapon of truth sharp enough to pierce the illusion they lived behind. It was not rage that drove her, it was calculation. Her patience was her power. For the first time, she was no longer alone in her fight. Whispers of allies began to appear, quiet figures who had their own reasons to see the empire fall. A lawyer who had once been silenced, a confidant who had lost too much to their greed. She did not trust easily, but she recognized necessity. With every careful conversation, with every discreet exchange of information, her circle widened just enough. She was not reckless. She remained the center, the one weaving the strands together. But she was no longer standing in the shadows by herself. Her silence grew heavier, and they began to notice. The calm she carried unsettled them, though they couldn't name why. There was a stillness about her now, the kind that clung to the air before a storm breaks. She didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't even react when her sacrifices went unacknowledged. Instead, she smiled softly, nodded, and carried on with her quiet routines. Yet beneath that calm surface, everything was shifting. The silence was not submission, it was suspense. And the moment they mistook it for weakness would be the moment it devoured them whole. It was arrogance that betrayed them. For years, her parents had perfected the illusion of control, every move calculated, every flaw concealed beneath layers of wealth and power. But one slip was all it took. A forged signature on a document too public to erase, a careless boast at a gathering where the wrong ear was listening. Suddenly, the mask faltered. For the first time, their grip wavered. They didn't notice it, not yet, but she did. To anyone else, it was a passing mistake. To her, it was a fracture, and fractures always spread. She recognized their vulnerability instantly. Where others saw noise, she saw a door unlocking. The slip wasn't just an error, it was an invitation. They had lived for so long believing themselves untouchable, yet now they had handed her the opening she had been waiting for. Her heart didn't race, her hands didn't tremble. She was calm, composed, watching the ground beneath them shift. Revenge wasn't a wild flame consuming her. It was ice, deliberate and patient. And now, with their carelessness laid bare, she had the perfect place to strike. The threads of her trap began to weave themselves into place. She moved with precision, never rushing, never revealing her hand. a document delivered anonymously to the right lawyer, a whisper in the ear of someone hungry for scandal, a subtle shift of funds traced back to its origin, left exposed like a trail of breadcrumbs. She built her case silently, like an architect designing a collapse. Every piece was positioned within 10 legal leaks, hidden alliances, and the quiet gathering of allies who had once been silenced by her parents' rule. What seemed invisible to them became a tightening noose only she could see. The irony was almost poetic. The same tools they had once used to cage her money, manipulation, secrets became her weapons. They had forced her to surrender opportunities, demanded her silence, and shaped her obedience into habit. But obedience had taught her patience. Silence had sharpened her listening. Their control had built the very arsenal that would undo them. Every demand they ever made, every time they dismissed her voice, had only given her the skill to dismantle them with precision. She resisted the urge to act too quickly. Confrontation was what they expected, what they were prepared to crush. Instead, she let them continue. She let them boast, spend, lie, and flaunt, believing the world was still blind to their cracks. She smiled at their arrogance, knowing each step they took in false security only buried them deeper. It was almost effortless, allowing them to dig their own graves, all while she stood quietly at the edge, holding the shovel they didn't know was missing. They began to sense something in her, though they could not define it. The silence they had once taken as weakness now unsettled them. Her calm was not the calm of submission, but the calm of control. Every word she didn't speak, every question she didn't ask, every nod she gave became unnerving. They felt it. In the air, the subtle shift of power they couldn't quite trace. She didn't threaten, didn't argue, didn't need to. Her very presence whispered that she knew something they didn't, and that was enough to rattle even the most arrogant. Tyrants, the suspense built around them like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. Those who watched from the outside could sense it, though her parents remained blind. The empire they had built was tilting, the ground beneath them softening, but pride made them deaf to the rumble of collapse. The audience of allies and enemies alike leaned in, waiting for the moment when arrogance would finally meet consequence. And through it all, she remained still, steady, the silent conductor of their downfall. One night, as she passed them in the hall, her father laughed at something trivial, her mother humming beside him. They looked so sure of themselves, so certain that she was nothing more than an obedient shadow. She paused only long enough to whisper, low enough that only the walls might remember, "They wanted me gone soon, they will pray I stayed." The words were not a threat, they were a prophecy. And like all prophecies, it was only a matter of time before it came true. The evening began like any other, quiet and deceptively ordinary, yet beneath its surface a storm had been building for years. I sat across the dining table, my fork moving absently through the food, pretending not to notice the disdain curling on my brother's lips. He had a talent for making even silence into a weapon. With every smirk, every dismissive glance, he reminded me of my place, the invisible one, the girl expected to endure. My parents exchanged weary looks, their silence heavy, as though they had long decided that conflict was easier to ignore than confront. I felt the sting of that silence deeper than any insult. The first blow wasn't physical, but words. My brother leaned back casually, his voice laced with contempt as he accused me of being careless, irresponsible, someone who could never do anything right. He spoke not to me, but through me, as though I were an object in the room rather than a person. His words were rehearsed sharp enough to wound, yet common enough to be dismissed as ordinary sibling quarrels by anyone watching. My mother's lips tightened. My father lowered his gaze. No one defended me. The betrayal wasn't new, but tonight it cut deeper. I tried to defend myself, but my words dissolved before they left my lips. What use was protest when no one listened? The walls of that home had been trained to echo only his voice. My silence was mistaken for weakness, when in truth it was something else entirely: observation, calculation, the slow gathering of storms. He mistook my stillness for defeat, not realizing it was the ground hardening before the quake. The dinner carried on, a charade of normalcy, but the air was heavier than it had ever been. My brother laughed at his own cruel remarks, as though the sound of my humiliation was entertainment. My parents busied themselves with trivialities, never daring to stop him, perhaps unwilling to admit their complicity. I chewed slowly, deliberately, every bite a rehearsal of patience. If they noticed how calm I seemed, they didn't understand what it meant. Calm is not surrender. It is preparation. When the plates were cleared and the lights dimmed, I withdrew into myself. The words of the evening replayed in my head, not as wounds but as blueprints. For years I had endured, believing endurance was my only weapon. But endurance is not passive, it shapes, it hardens, it teaches. Tonight I realized that silence could be sharpened into something else entirely. Every insult, every dismissal, every act of betrayal had been weaving itself into a rope. And ropes can bind, but they can also strangle. In my room, I sat in the dark, listening to the muffled echoes of their laughter down the hall. It struck me how easy betrayal becomes when people believe you have no voice. But the voiceless, when they rise, do not shout. They whisper, and their whispers spread like smoke until the whole room is choking on it. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to fight on their terms. Revenge, I realized, was not about anger, it was about balance. And balance takes time. I looked into the mirror and saw myself differently than I ever had before. Not as the quiet girl overshadowed by cruelty, but as someone holding the pieces of a puzzle no one else knew existed. My brother's arrogance blinded him. He believed I was harmless. My parents' silence trained them to underestimate me. And that underestimation was my greatest power. For the first time in years, I felt something close to freedom because I knew the game had shifted. That night, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not react in haste. I would not allow rage to dictate my hand. Instead, I would become deliberate, calculated. My revenge would not be loud or obvious, it would be precise, unfolding piece by piece until they finally understood what silence can do when it decides to break. And as I lay down to sleep, their voices faded into the background. I closed my eyes, not with despair, but with the cold clarity of someone who has finally chosen her path. The storm they had sown was coming, and it would not announce itself with thunder. It would arrive like the quietest of nights until the silence itself became unbearable. The day of reckoning did not arrive with chaos, but with precision. What had taken years of silent endurance, quiet calculation, and patient restraint now unfolded in the most public way possible. One headline, then another, spread like wildfire. Fraud, corruption, embezzlement. Their empire, the fortress they had built through fear and deceit, collapsed under the weight of undeniable evidence. Bank accounts froze, assets were seized, and invitations to the prestigious gatherings they once dominated were swiftly revoked. Associates scrambled to distance themselves, and those who once bowed to their influence now watched with morbid delight as their fall played out in plain sight. In the beginning, they tried to deny it, their voices loud and indignant, clinging to the arrogance that had shielded them for years. But denial is fragile when documents, recordings, and witnesses emerge with perfect timing, each revelation tightening the noose. What they didn't know, what they never even suspected, was that the architect of their ruin was their own daughter. While they spun lies and flaunted power, she had been collecting threads, weaving them into a net so intricate there was no escape once it closed. The parents who had once sat like monarchs, passing judgment with cold eyes and sharp tongues, found themselves dethroned in the most humiliating fashion. They had rolled through intimidation, silencing her voice at every turn, yet now the world silenced them. Friends stopped answering calls, allies turned their backs, and even their loyal enablers vanished into the shadows. Fear had once been their currency, but stripped of influence, they were nothing more than bitter figures mocked in whispers. Their kingdom had not been stolen. It had been dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but dust and disgrace. Through it all, she did not rage, did not gloat, did not raise her voice in triumph. Her silence was more cutting than any declaration could have been. When the world expected vengeance to arrive with spectacle, she chose composure. She walked through the wreckage they had created with steady grace, every step a reminder that true power is never loud. It is the calm presence of the victor who no longer needs to prove anything. They had tried to break her with cruelty, yet in the end, it was her restraint that destroyed them. Her life, once suffocated under their control, opened like a new horizon. Papers signed in her own name, contracts negotiated without anyone pulling strings, the keys to a home that belonged solely to her, each small victory a declaration that she was free. Awards arrived not as gifts, but as recognition earned through her own skill and persistence. For the first time, her days belonged only to her. No more cages disguised as family obligation, no more chains hidden behind expectations. The life they swore she could never build without them now stood solid before her eyes, unshakable because it had been built with her own hands. And yet, the sweetest twist was not in their collapse, but in the realization that every lesson they had forced upon her had become her arsenal. They demanded obedience, so she learned to listen without revealing her thoughts. They demanded silence, so she mastered the art of watching, collecting, waiting. They demanded sacrifice, so she trained herself to endure, to carry weight others would crumble under. What they intended as tools of submission became the very weapons she wielded to dismantle their world. They had unknowingly forged their own destruction through the years they spent trying to break her spirit. When all was said and done, she did not need to raise her voice or strike a final blow. The world had already declared the verdict. All she left behind was a single truth, a quiet line that would echo louder than their years of cruelty. They taught me obedience, silence, and sacrifice. I used every lesson they gave me to destroy them, and with that, she walked forward into her new life, leaving behind the ashes of theirs.